Most salespeople celebrate when they close a deal. They ring a bell, they update the CRM, they feel a spike of dopamine, and then they move on to the next prospect. And that right there, that moment of moving on, is where most salespeople silently destroy their own careers. Here's the uncomfortable truth that almost nobody in sales wants to hear. The close is not the finish line. The close is the starting line, and if you treat it as the finish line, you are running in circles for the rest of your professional life. I want to talk about something that took me years to understand. Not just intellectually, I could have told you relationships matter on day one. Everyone can say that, but understanding it at the level of behavior, at the level of daily decisions, at the level of what you actually do when nobody's watching on a Tuesday afternoon, that's a completely different thing. And that's what this conversation is really about. Let's start with the way most people think about sales. The dominant mental model, the one taught in most training programs, most YouTube videos, most books, is what I'd call the transaction frame. In the transaction frame, every interaction with a client is evaluated through one question. Will this lead to a sale? If the answer is yes, you invest energy. If the answer is no, or if the answer is not right now, you withdraw. You go find someone who's closer to buying. On the surface, this seems rational, efficient, even. You have limited time. You have targets. You need to focus on people who are ready to buy, so you optimize for speed to close. But here's what the transaction frame misses, and it's not a small thing, it's the entire game. When you optimize for speed to close, you are systematically filtering out the people who would have become your most valuable relationships. Because the highest value clients, the ones who bring repeat business, who refer you to their network, who defend your reputation in rooms you'll never enter, those people almost never buy fast. They buy slow. They observe. They test. They watch how you behave when there's nothing in it for you. And the transaction frame tells you to deprioritize exactly those people. So you end up in a brutal paradox. The harder you optimize for closing, the more you repel the clients who would have made closing unnecessary in the long run. I've seen this happen hundreds of times. A salesperson chases a quick deal, burns through a relationship, collects the commission, and then 6 months later has to start from zero again, cold calling, cold emailing, grinding for attention in a market that doesn't know them and doesn't trust them. Meanwhile, someone else, someone who played the longer game, is getting inbound referrals, warm introductions, and clients who show up already wanting to work with them. Same industry, same product. Completely different experience of what it means to sell. So here's the core judgment I want to give you, and I want you to sit with this for a moment because it sounds simple, but it will restructure how you think about your work if you actually take it seriously. A closed deal is a cost. A long-term relationship is an asset. Let me explain what I mean. When you close a deal and that's the end of it, you got paid, the client got their product, and you never speak again, what did you actually build? You exchanged time and effort for a one-time payment. That's labor. That's a cost of doing business. You burned energy to extract a result, and now the energy is gone. But when you close a deal and it becomes the beginning of a relationship, when that client comes back, when they refer someone, when they mention your name in a conversation you'll never hear, now that original effort is generating returns you didn't have to work for. That's not labor, that's an asset, and assets compound. Naval talks about this distinction constantly. He says the key to wealth is owning assets that earn while you sleep. Most people hear that and think of stocks or real estate or code. But a relationship, a real, trust-based, long-term relationship, is one of the most powerful assets a human being can own. It generates opportunity. It generates information. It generates credibility. And unlike financial assets, it's almost impossible to commoditize or replicate. Charlie Munger would frame it differently. He'd say, invert. Instead of asking, how do I get more clients? Ask, how would I guarantee that I never get a referral? The answer is obvious. You treat every interaction as transactional. You'd disappear after the sale. You'd only show up when you need something. You'd make the client feel like a number. Munger's principle of inversion reveals that most salespeople are already doing exactly the things that guarantee they never build compounding relationships. They just don't see it because the short-term feedback, the closed deal, the commission, the applause masks the long-term destruction. Now let me take you one layer deeper, because I don't want you to just take my word for this. I want you to understand the mechanism, the actual wiring inside your brain that makes this dynamic work. When you interact with another person, your brain is constantly running a background process. It's not a conscious process. You can't control it. It's happening below the surface, and it's asking one question over and over. Is this person safe, or is this person a threat? This is your amygdala doing its job. The amygdala is an ancient structure in the brain, and it was designed for survival. It doesn't care about your sales pitch. It doesn't care about your product features. It cares about one thing: can I trust this person? And here's the critical part. The amygdala processes this information faster than your prefrontal cortex. The rational, analytical part of your brain can evaluate the content of what someone is saying. Which means your client has already decided whether they trust you before they've fully processed your proposal. The feeling comes before the logic. So what triggers the amygdala to classify you as safe versus threatening? It's not your words. It's not your slide deck. It's a collection of micro-signals. Your tone, your consistency, whether you follow through on small promises, whether you show up when there's no transaction on the table, whether your attention feels genuine or performative. These signals are picked up by mirror neurons, a network of brain cells that essentially simulate the internal state of the person you're interacting with. When someone is genuinely interested in you, your mirror neurons detect that. When someone is pretending to be interested because they want something from you, your mirror neurons detect that too. You might not be able to articulate it, but you feel it. Everyone feels it. This is why manipulative sales tactics have a shelf life. They might work once, they might even work a few times, but over repeated interactions, the client's brain accumulates evidence. And eventually, the amygdala renders its verdict. This person is performing. This person is not safe. And once that verdict is delivered, no amount of charm, no discount, no clever objection-handling technique will reverse it. Trust, once lost at the neurological level, is extraordinarily expensive to rebuild. Now flip the scenario. When you show up consistently, when you follow up without an agenda, when you share information that helps the client even if it doesn't lead to a sale, when you remember details about their situation that have nothing to do with your product, something different happens in their brain. Their amygdala calms down. Their prefrontal cortex comes online. They shift from a defensive processing mode to an open processing mode. And in that open mode, they're not just more likely to buy from you. They're more likely to think of you, remember you, recommend you, and forgive you when you make a mistake, because you're no longer a vendor in their mind. You're a trusted node in their network. You're an asset in their life. This is the neuroscience of what people casually call rapport. But it's much deeper than rapport. Rapport is a surface-level concept. What we're really talking about is the neurological infrastructure of trust, something that takes time to build, that requires consistency to maintain, and that generates returns for years once it's established. There's another brain mechanism at work here, and most salespeople have never heard of it even though it governs their entire career. It's called the dopamine prediction error. Here's how it works. Your brain's dopamine system doesn't just respond to rewards. It responds to the difference between what you expected and what you got. If you expected a reward and got it, dopamine response is flat. Nothing remarkable happened. If you expected a reward and didn't get it, dopamine drops and you feel disappointed. But if you got a reward you didn't expect, something positive happened that you didn't predict, dopamine spikes dramatically. And that spike does something powerful. It flags the experience as worth remembering. It tells your brain, pay attention to whatever caused this, seek it out again. Now think about what this means for client relationships. When you close a deal and then vanish, when the client only hears from you when it's time to renew or upsell, you're perfectly predictable. The client knows exactly when you'll show up and why. There's no positive prediction error. There's no dopamine spike, your wallpaper. But when you reach out unexpectedly, when you send an article that's relevant to their situation, when you check in after a difficult quarter, when you introduce them to someone in your network who could help them with a problem that has nothing to do with your product, you create a positive prediction error. The client's brain says, I didn't expect that. This person just provided value without asking for anything. And dopamine floods in, encoding the experience, making your name and your face more salient in their memory. This is not manipulation. Let me be very clear about that. Manipulation is when you engineer a positive experience for the purpose of extracting something later. What I'm describing is different. What I'm describing is a genuine orientation toward the other person's well-being, an orientation that happens to be perfectly aligned with your long-term self-interest. These are not in conflict. In fact, the Talmud articulates this principle with extraordinary clarity. The best business is the kind where both parties walk away feeling they gained more than they gave. That's not idealism. That's the only sustainable model for repeated exchange. Let me give you a concrete scene so this doesn't stay abstract. Imagine two salespeople. Let's call them salesperson A and salesperson B. They work in the same company. They sell the same product. They have comparable skills. Salesperson A closes a deal with a mid-size company. Good deal, nice commission. Client is reasonably happy. Salesperson A updates the CRM, sends a thank you email with a template, and moves on. 3 months later, they reach out because it's time for a quarterly review, which is really just a thinly disguised upsell conversation. The client takes the call, is polite, buys nothing, and forgets about it. 12 months later, salesperson A's territory has churned. Some clients didn't renew, some went to competitors. Salesperson A is back to cold outreach, fighting for every meeting, burning through prospects like kindling. Now salesperson B. Same deal, same client, same commission. But after the close, salesperson B does something different. 2 weeks later, they send a short note, not a template, referencing something the client mentioned during the sales process about a challenge they were having with onboarding new team members. The note includes a link to a podcast episode about onboarding best practices. No pitch, no ask, just, I thought of you when I heard this. A month later, salesperson B sees a news article about the client's industry. They forward it with a one-line comment, figured this might be on your radar. Again, no pitch. 3 months later, when the quarterly review comes, the client actually looks forward to the conversation. Not because they want to buy more, but because they've begun to associate salesperson B with value, not cost. They feel seen. They feel understood. Their amygdala has filed salesperson B under safe. Their mirror neurons have registered genuine interest. Their dopamine system has been positively surprised multiple times. 6 months in, the client's colleague at another company mentions they're looking for a solution. And here's the moment where everything changes. The client doesn't say, let me think about who might help. They immediately say, you should talk to my person, not my vendor, not the salesperson from that company. They say my person. That language, that possessive, identity-level language, tells you everything. Salesperson B has become an asset in the client's network, and that referral, it converts at a rate that cold outreach cannot touch. Studies consistently show that referred leads close at 3 to 5 times the rate of cold leads, and the relationship starts at a higher trust baseline. Fast forward another 12 months. Salesperson A has closed, let's say, 30 deals, all from scratch, all through cold outreach, hard pitching, aggressive follow-up. Their pipeline is full but fragile. Every quarter feels like starting over. Salesperson B has closed 22 deals, fewer than salesperson A in raw numbers, but 8 of those 22 were referrals, 4 were repeat purchases, and the total revenue higher than salesperson A's. Because repeat clients and referral clients buy more, negotiate less, and stay longer, and the effort required to generate those sales dramatically less. This is what compound relationships look like in real numbers. And it's invisible to anyone who only measures activity, calls made, emails sent, meetings booked. The standard sales dashboard doesn't have a column for trust accumulated. But trust accumulated is the single greatest predictor of long-term sales performance. Now I want to address something that I think stops a lot of people from playing this game, even when they intellectually understand it. And that something is anxiety. When you're in a sales role and you have monthly targets, quarterly targets, annual targets, there is an enormous internal pressure to prioritize the short term. And that pressure is not irrational. If you don't hit your number this month, you might not be around to build relationships next month. I understand that. I've lived that. But here's what I've learned, and this connects to something deep about how our nervous system works. Anxiety about the future narrows your attention. Neurologically, when you're anxious, your brain shifts into what's called a threat-focused attentional mode. Your reticular activating system, the RAS, the filter that determines what you notice and what you ignore, begins to prioritize threats. The missed quota the competitors offer, the client who isn't returning your calls. And when your RAS is locked onto threats, you literally cannot see opportunities. They're there. They're in your inbox, in your conversations, in the body language of the person across the table. But your brain has decided they're not relevant to survival, so it filters them out. This is not a metaphor. This is the actual mechanism by which anxiety reduces your income. Not because anxious people are lazy, they're often working harder than anyone else, but because anxiety degrades the quality of attention, and the quality of attention is the raw material of every relationship. So the question becomes, how do you stay present in a relationship when the pressure of the quarter is screaming at you to close, close, close? And the answer, which will sound counterintuitive, is that you don't try to suppress the pressure. You redirect your attention toward what you're building, not what you're lacking. This is the same principle that applies to confidence. Real confidence doesn't come from a positive self-talk ritual in front of the mirror. Real confidence comes from releasing your attachment to the outcome and fully investing in the process in front of you. When you're with a client and you're genuinely focused on understanding their world, not performing interest, but actually being interested, two things happen simultaneously. First, you become more effective because your attention is sharper, your questions are better, and the client senses your authenticity. Second, your anxiety drops because anxiety requires you to project into the future, and genuine engagement anchors you in the present. You can't be anxious and fully present at the same time. They're neurologically incompatible states. This is why I say that sales is not just a professional skill, it's a personal development practice. Every meaningful client interaction is an opportunity to train your brain to be present, to listen, to delay gratification, to invest without immediate return. These are not soft skills. These are the hardest skills in the world. And they are the most valuable. Let me go deeper into the skill-building side of this, because knowing that long-term relationships matter is useless if you don't know how to actually build them. And most people don't. Most people think relationship building means be nice and stay in touch. Those are not strategies, those are vibes. Here's what actual relationship building looks like, broken down into practicable components. The first component is what I call deep listening with recall. Most people listen to respond. They're waiting for the client to stop talking so they can deliver their point. Deep listening means you're listening to understand the client's situation, not just their stated needs, but their context. What pressures are they under? What's keeping them up at night? What do they care about that has nothing to do with your product? And recall means you actually remember it. You write it down after the conversation. You reference it in your next interaction. When a client tells you their daughter just started university, and 3 months later you ask how she's settling in, that's not a trick. That's evidence that you were actually listening. And the client's brain registers that evidence with a dopamine spike of positive prediction error. They didn't expect you to remember. You did. Now you're different from every other salesperson they've ever met. This is a skill you can practice deliberately. After every client conversation, take 3 minutes, literally 3 minutes, and write down 3 things the client mentioned that had nothing to do with the deal. Their concerns, their personal life, their industry observations. Then, before your next conversation with that client, review those notes. This is not some advanced sales methodology. This is basic human respect, systematized. And it works because it's rare. Most salespeople are so focused on their own agenda that they've never systematically tracked what matters to the other person. The second component is value delivery without transaction. This means providing something useful to the client when there is nothing for you to gain. An article, an introduction, a piece of feedback, a heads up about a market shift. The key is that it must be genuinely relevant to them, not a generic newsletter blast, not a just checking in email that's obviously a fishing expedition. It has to demonstrate that you've thought about their specific situation. This is hard, it takes time, it takes knowledge of their industry, it takes genuine care, and that's precisely why it's so effective, because it's costly to fake. Clients can tell the difference, and the few who do it consistently build reputations that become self-reinforcing. The third component is consistency over intensity. A lot of salespeople try to build relationships through grand gestures, the expensive dinner, the golf outing, the lavish gift. And those things aren't bad, but they're dramatically less effective than simple consistency. A short, thoughtful message every month is worth more than an extravagant gift once a year. Why? Because trust is built through repeated micro-interactions, not through single dramatic events. Your brain doesn't calculate trust from one data point. It calculates trust from pattern recognition over time. The client's brain is asking, does this person show up reliably? Can I predict their behavior? Are they the same person in the small moments as they are in the big ones? Consistency answers all 3 questions simultaneously. The fourth component is transparent self-interest. This one might surprise you. I am not telling you to hide the fact that you're in sales. I am not telling you to pretend you don't care about revenue. In fact, I think one of the fastest ways to destroy trust is to pretend you're not selling when you obviously are. Clients are not stupid. They know you have targets. They know you want their business. And when you pretend otherwise, their mirror neurons detect the incongruence, and the amygdala flags you as untrustworthy. Instead, be transparent. Say, I want to earn your business, and I think the best way to do that is to make sure you genuinely benefit from working with me. That's honest, that's clean, that aligns your incentives openly instead of hiding them behind a performance of selflessness. The Talmud has a principle for this. A contract should be clear enough that both parties can explain it to a stranger. Ambiguity in intent is the enemy of trust. When your client knows exactly what you want and can see that your method of getting it is to help them succeed, the relationship becomes structurally sound. It can bear weight. It can survive disagreements. It can last. There's a concept in Charlie Munger's thinking that applies powerfully here, and it's the idea of the Lollapalooza effect, the compounding impact of multiple forces working in the same direction simultaneously. When you combine deep listening, unexpected value delivery, consistency, and transparent self-interest, You don't get a linear improvement in your client relationships. You get a non-linear explosion. Because each factor reinforces the others. The client trusts you because you listen. Because they trust you, they're more open, which gives you more information to listen to. Because you have more information, you can deliver more relevant value. Because you deliver relevant value, they remember you. Because they remember you, they refer you. Because referrals come in pre-trusted, those new relationships start at a higher baseline. And the cycle accelerates. This is the compound interest of human relationships. And like financial compound interest, it's almost invisible in the early stages. In the first 3 months, you'll feel like you're investing energy for no return. In the first 6 months, you'll question whether it's worth it. By month 12, you'll start to see the first signs. By month 24, you'll be operating in a fundamentally different reality than your peers who are still grinding through cold outreach. But, and this is critical, compounding only works if you don't interrupt it. If you break trust, if you get greedy, if you revert to transactional behavior under pressure, you reset the clock to 0. And resetting the clock in a relationship is far more expensive than resetting it in a financial portfolio, because people remember betrayal in a way that spreadsheets don't. I want to address the B2B dimension of this specifically, because I think it's where long-term relationship building has the highest return on investment, and yet is the most commonly misunderstood. In B2C, in consumer markets, relationships are often shallow and driven by brand, price, and convenience. A consumer might love your product but switch to a competitor because they offered free shipping. The switching cost is low. The emotional attachment is limited. In B2B, everything is different. The sales cycles are longer. The decision-making involves multiple stakeholders. The switching costs are higher. And this is the crucial part. The buyer's personal reputation is on the line. When a VP of operations chooses your solution, they're not just spending company money. They're putting their judgment on display. If your product fails, they look bad. If your product succeeds, they look good. This means the B2B buyer is not just evaluating your product. They're evaluating you as a person. Can I trust this person to deliver? Can I trust this person to tell me the truth when things go wrong? Can I trust this person to still be here in 12 months? And this is where long-term relationship building becomes not just an advantage, but a structural necessity. Because the B2B buyer who trusts you will fight for you internally. They'll champion your solution in meetings you're not invited to. They'll defend your pricing to their finance team. They'll give you information about competitors that they'd never share with a vendor they didn't trust. In essence, the trusted salesperson gains an unpaid advocate inside the client's organization. And that advocate is worth more than any marketing campaign, any discount, any feature comparison chart. But you only earn that advocate through time, through consistency, through proving over and over that you prioritize the relationship over the transaction. That you'll tell them when your product isn't the right fit. That you'll flag problems before they become crises. That you'll show up when there's nothing in it for you. This is what I mean when I say that for an individual, especially someone operating independently, building their own practice, selling their own expertise, the B2B relationship model is not just preferable. It's the only viable path, because individuals cannot compete with corporations on reach, on brand awareness, on advertising spend. But individuals can compete, and often win, on depth of relationship, on speed of trust building, on personal accountability. A corporation sends you to a call center. An individual picks up the phone. A corporation gives you a scripted response. An individual gives you their judgment. And in a world that's increasingly automated and impersonal, that human judgment, that personal accountability, becomes more valuable, not less. Now, I want to talk about something that I think is the hardest part of this entire equation, and it's the part that nobody wants to discuss. It's the emotional labor of relationship building. Building long-term client relationships is not glamorous. It's not exciting. There's no immediate payoff. You send a thoughtful message and sometimes you get no response. You invest time in someone and they go with a competitor anyway. You show up consistently for months, and then the client's company restructures and your contact leaves and you have to start over. This is where most people quit, not because they don't understand the strategy, but because the emotional cost of sustained investment without guaranteed return is higher than they expected. And this connects to something fundamental about how we process effort and reward. Your brain's dopamine system, the same system I described earlier, creates a prediction model. It expects a certain amount of reward for a certain amount of effort. When you put in effort and the reward doesn't come on schedule, dopamine drops. And when dopamine drops, your motivation drops. You start to doubt the strategy. You start to think maybe the transactional approach was right after all. Maybe you should just focus on closing. This is where discipline becomes essential, and I don't mean discipline in the motivational poster sense. I mean discipline as a structural practice. You build systems that make the relationship-building behavior automatic, regardless of how you feel. You schedule follow-ups. You maintain a client notes file. You set weekly reminders to deliver value to your top 20 relationships. You treat these behaviors the same way you treat brushing your teeth, not because you feel like it, not because it's exciting, but because the long-term cost of not doing it is catastrophic. And here's what happens over time, and this is the beautiful part, the part that makes all the discipline worth it. As you consistently engage in relationship-building behavior, your brain's prediction model updates. It starts to associate the behavior with eventual reward, not immediate reward, eventual reward, and this is a fundamentally different neural pattern. It's the pattern of someone who operates on a long time horizon. It's the pattern of someone who can delay gratification. It's the pattern of someone who builds wealth, in every sense of the word, instead of extracting income. The neuroscience literature on this is very clear. The ability to delay gratification is one of the strongest predictors of success across every domain. It's not talent, it's not intelligence, it's not charisma. It's the ability to invest today for a return that won't arrive until tomorrow, or next month, or next year. And relationship building is one of the purest forms of delayed gratification that exists in professional life. I'm going to share something personal here because I think it matters. I build AI training tools for salespeople. That's one of the things I do. And the entire philosophy behind those tools is that sales growth is not about memorizing scripts or learning 100 closing techniques. It's about developing the internal capacity to be present with another person, to understand their world, to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing whether the deal will close, and to invest in the relationship regardless. The AI I've built helps salespeople do daily reviews, not just of their pipeline, but of their conversations. What did the client actually say? What were they really concerned about? Where did I stop listening and start pitching? Where did I feel the urge to rush to the close, and what was driving that urge? These are not traditional sales metrics. They're growth metrics. They're the kind of questions that, if you answer them honestly every day for 6 months, will transform not just your sales numbers, but your fundamental capacity for human connection. And the reason I built this tool is because I believe, based on everything I've studied and everything I've experienced, that sales is not separate from personal growth. Sales is personal growth. Every time you sit across from a client and choose to listen instead of pitch, you're training your prefrontal cortex to override your amygdala's fear response. Every time you follow up without an agenda, you're training your dopamine system to operate on a longer time horizon. Every time you resist the urge to oversell, you're building the muscle of integrity that will compound across every area of your life. This is why I reject the idea that sales is a dirty word. Sales, done correctly, is one of the most ethical things you can do. Because real sales, the kind I'm talking about, is the act of helping someone make a decision that genuinely serves them. And if you can't sell, your ideas die inside your head. Your knowledge benefits no one. Your expertise stays locked in a room. The world doesn't get to use what you've spent years building. Selling yourself is not vanity, it's responsibility. If you have something valuable and you don't put it in front of the people who need it, you're not being humble. You're being selfish. Let me give you another layer of this, because I think one of the biggest mistakes people make with long-term relationship building is treating it as a niceness strategy. It's not. It's a judgment strategy. Not every client deserves a long-term relationship. Not every prospect is worth your sustained investment. This is where Munger's concept of the circle of competence applies, but I'd expand it to what I call a circle of alignment. You should be building deep relationships with people who are in your circle of alignment, people whose values, needs, and trajectory match what you can genuinely deliver. If a client needs something you can't provide, the most relationship-building thing you can do is tell them. Refer them to someone else. Be honest about the mismatch. That act of honesty, which costs you a deal in the short term, pays dividends in the long term because it demonstrates something the client's brain almost never encounters from a salesperson. Prioritization of truth over transaction. And this connects to a principle from the Talmud that has stayed with me for years. The merchant who knows his goods are flawed and sells them anyway has committed a greater wrong than the thief. Because the thief at least knows he's a thief. The dishonest merchant has corrupted his own judgment. He's lost the ability to distinguish between what he wants to be true and what is true. And once that distinction collapses, every relationship he builds will be constructed on an unstable foundation. So when I talk about building long-term client relationships, I am not talking about being everyone's friend. I am not talking about saying yes to every request. I am talking about making clear-eyed judgments about where your value genuinely lies, and then investing disproportionately in those relationships where the fit is real. This is the opposite of spray and pray. This is surgical. This is strategic. And paradoxically, it's also the most caring approach because you're not wasting anyone's time, including your own. Let me bring this to the skill level now, because I want you to walk away from this with something you can actually use. Here's a practice I call the relationship audit. Do it once a week. It takes 20 minutes. Step 1. List your top 20 client relationships. Not your 20 biggest accounts, your 20 most strategically important relationships. The people who, if they fully trusted you, would transform your business. Step 2. For each person, answer 3 questions. When was the last time I provided value to this person without asking for anything? What do I know about their current challenges that has nothing to do with my product? And what is one thing I could do this week to strengthen this relationship? Step 3. Do the one thing, don't wait, don't overthink. Send the message, make the introduction, share the article. The action doesn't need to be big. It needs to be genuine, and it needs to happen this week. If you do this practice every week for 3 months, I promise you 2 things. First, your client retention will improve measurably. And second, and this matters more, you will begin to experience sales differently. It will stop feeling like a grind and start feeling like what it actually is. The construction of a network of trust that generates opportunity continuously. Here's a second practice. I call it the post-conversation download. Every time you finish a meaningful client conversation, before you check your email, before you take your next call, take 90 seconds and answer these 3 questions in writing. What did the client care about most in that conversation? What did I miss or rush past? And what would I do differently if I had that conversation again? This is the structure of deliberate practice applied to relationship building. You're not just having conversations and hoping you get better. You're extracting the signal from each conversation, identifying the gap between what you did and what you could have done, and creating a feedback loop that systematically improves your relational intelligence over time. This is how expertise is built in every domain, from chess to surgery to music, and there is no reason it cannot be applied to the most important skill in business, the skill of earning and keeping another person's trust. Before I close, I want to anticipate an objection, because I know some of you are thinking it. This all sounds great, Leon, but I don't have the luxury of playing the long game. I have bills to pay. I have targets to hit. I need to close deals now. I hear you, and I'm not telling you to stop closing. I'm telling you to stop only closing. The two are not in conflict. You can pursue short-term revenue and build long-term relationships simultaneously. The mistake is thinking they require different activities. They don't. The same conversation that closes a deal today can plant the seed for a relationship that generates 5 deals over the next 3 years. It's not about what you do. It's about the orientation you bring to what you do. If you go into every conversation thinking, how do I close this person? Your attention narrows, your listening degrades, and the client feels the pressure. If you go into every conversation thinking, how do I understand this person's world and demonstrate that I can genuinely help, you still close. Often you close faster. Because the client's defenses drop, their prefrontal cortex activates, and they make better decisions, which, if your product is actually good, means they decide in your favor. The long game and the short game are not enemies. The long game is the short game done with integrity, repeated over time. I want to leave you with one more thing. A pattern I've observed in every successful salesperson, every successful entrepreneur, every successful person I've ever studied or worked alongside. They all, without exception, measure their progress by what they've built, not by what they've closed. They look at the end of a quarter and they don't just count the revenue. They count the relationships that deepened, the trust that was earned, the referrals that came in unsolicited, the conversations where someone said, "I thought of you because." Those are the leading indicators. Revenue is a lagging indicator. It tells you what happened. Relationships tell you what's about to happen. And if you can train yourself to measure the right things, to find satisfaction in the deposit of trust rather than only in the withdrawal of commission, you will build something that most salespeople never build. You will build a career that gets easier over time instead of harder, a reputation that precedes you into rooms you haven't entered yet, a network that generates opportunity without you having to hunt for it. That's not a fantasy. That's the mathematical consequence of compound trust, applied consistently over years. A deal gives you income. A relationship gives you a future. The difference between the two is not talent, it's not luck. It's a decision you make every single day about what you're actually building. If this resonated, share it with someone who's in the grind right now, someone who might need to hear that there's a different way to play this game. And drop a comment or a reply. I'd love to hear your answer to this. What's the longest client or professional relationship you've maintained, and what's the one thing that kept it alive?